Ahead on NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman.
On this week's special edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman, we sit down with a panel of experts to talk specific strategy for coping with the impacts of the drought as we head into winter. NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman starts right now.
And now, NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman with host Kevin Oxner.
Hello and welcome to this week's special edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. I'm Kevin Oxner. Thanks for joining us. It's possible that this year nothing is impacting the cattle industry more than the drought. And although cooler weather and snow are setting in across much of the country, the impacts will be felt until precipitation levels change. Here's a look at the latest drought monitor tracked by the U.S. government. Parts of the southeast and the central section of the country continue to face serious drought conditions. And that's what brings us here today. What can cattlemen do in terms of cattle nutrition and alternative feeds this winter? Joining me in the studio are Dr. John Patterson, Executive Director of Producer Education with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, Dr. Kent Tjardis, Cattle Consultant with Purina Mills, Dr. Chance Farmer, also Technical Consultant with Purina, and finally, Carrie Wickstrom. Carrie is president of Wickstrom Incorporated here in northeastern Colorado. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming to the show today.
Yeah.
You know, Dr. Patterson, let's begin by just introducing yourself to the folks. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you, Kevin. John Patterson, Executive Director, Producer Education for NCBA. And my job is to get educational programs out for our producers in the United States. My background is I've been in New Mexico, Utah, Nebraska, Missouri, Montana for about 19 years, and I've been with NCBA for about 7 months.
We're glad to have you. Dr. Tjardis.
Yeah, I'm originally from Illinois, from a cattle and grain operation. I got 2 degrees at Illinois, PhD up at Michigan State, and then I was on faculty for a while at South Dakota State. I've been with Prenatal Nutrition now for about 5 years, out of Omaha, and I cover mainly Nebraska and into South Dakota.
Chance, you're no newcomer to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself, though.
I live in Canyon Lake, Texas, which is about 45 minutes north of San Antonio. I've been with Purina nearly 10 years now as a grass cattle consultant. I work all of Central Texas, all of South Texas, and along the Gulf Coast region into Southwest Louisiana. Mostly work with brood cow producers, but some stocker and backgrounding outfits as well. And from time to time get into some backgrounding growing yards as well. So it's been a good experience.
And Carrie, tell us a little bit about your operation up in northeastern Colorado. I'm
a 4th generation. I'm an alum of Colorado State University, and we grow wheat, corn, and millet on dry land, and then we're a stocker and feedlot operation, along with the rest of my family.
Very good, and we're all glad to have you all here this evening. We're going to ask you a bunch of questions about this topic. Dr. Patterson, I'll begin with you. The fact of the matter is, we all know nutrition has some far-reaching impact in our operation. Tell us, how do people know they have a nutritional issue?
What we do is we train people how to read body condition on those cows. You don't have to be real smart to figure out she's a thin cow, but what you got to be smart about is she's thin today. I know she's going to calve in March. How am I going to get her from a thin condition now to a moderate condition in March so I don't have problems with that cow? So body condition is the basis of a lot of what we do. And
we were talking, you've had a chance to visit with a lot of people the last 60 days. Give us an example of some of the challenges that you hear folks facing.
Well, working on a ranch in New Mexico, the calves wean beautifully, just perfect, 550, which is a nice weaning weight for those cattle. Unfortunately, the pregnancy rates on the cows was about 52%. We've got a real challenge there to get those cows turned around so they can calve again, and even to get the cows rebred. The second one is out of the Midwest. The rain was great, caused the grass to green up. Unfortunately, they'll be out of grass by Thanksgiving, and they're going to be back on a hay-based ration or some other program, maybe like corn stalks, if they can get to those, but the grass is gone for them.
Yeah. And Dr. Farmer, I guess the question is, you know, all feedstuffs are so expensive right now that it's real tempting to try to take some shortcuts and try to save yourself a few dollars here and then. What are some of the ramifications of making those kind of decisions?
Right. Well, you just heard Dr. Patterson mention some of the short-term ramifications are bad pregnancy rates, and certainly in some situations where it was bad enough, you know, you get weaning weights that aren't where they need to be. But from a long-term standpoint, you have to think about some of the fetal programming information that's out there now indicates that these heifer offspring that are in womb during these droughts, later on we have fertility issues with them. So we're looking at fertility issues 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road that we're going to have to be dealing with because of the drought that's occurred this year. The other part of that is your forage piece. If you've hammered your forage pretty tough this year, then there's a likely chance that next year it's not going to come out like it's supposed to, and that may not be a one-year deal. That may be, again, 3, 4, 5 years where you're having less forage than you had before just because of 1 year's abuse. So the cow and the forage situation can get pretty bleak when you think about the long-term ramifications of a drought.
And certainly some long-term consequences we have to consider. And Dr. Tajardis, what would you add to that?
Yeah, like Dr. Farmer said, you really got to watch your resources, your grass. And like Dr. Patterson said, one of the things that you're tempted to do is when that grass greens up to go out there and go after it. But you're better off, to wait, let it build up and get some root growth and get some stores in there and recover a little bit, because down the road, if you go after that grass too early, you're going to end up spending more on supplement than if you would have just let it get basically some growth to it.
Very good. Kerry, we didn't have much rain up in our neck of the woods this summer, or frankly last spring. How did that impact your operation?
We kept our yearlings out as long as we could, but we went on CRP to try to put as many pounds on as we could and keep them out of the feed yard. But we've used all our grass, so I'm concerned about next year and how things are going to go as we look ahead. But we also tried to procure as many feed sources as we could. We bought a lot of corn stalks. I like to buy alfalfa, but corn stalks I think made more sense from an economic standpoint because we feed wet distillers, so we don't have the protein needs. But we fed wheat this past summer in the feed yard, trying to cheapen up our rations. And as we look ahead, there's frankly not a lot of good options, but we'll keep doing what we can. Beet pulp in our area out of the sugar factory, they had a good beet crop, so we're fortunate we had that resource that's priced right for our grower rations.
Very good. And we'll come back to you and ask you some questions about some of those alternative feeds in a little bit later in the show. Dr. Patterson, I want to get back to you. You mentioned body condition scores. What other tactics would you recommend for troubleshooting the specific issues a person might have in their cow herd related to nutrition?
Well, I think the things that we've got to do is, number one, let's get the body condition figured out. Number two, how much forage do I have at home? Grazing, hay, whatever, and by golly, we got to get an analysis of it because we don't want to waste it. We want to feed just enough, but not too much. The third one that I recommend in lots of the country, got to tell me about the water. Because of the drought, the water in these ponds concentrated, a lot more salt in that water now, which can cause us problems. So body condition score, match that with forage quality and quantity, and then let's look at the water as well.
So we've done our analysis. We know we have a problem. We identify where some of our deficiencies are. Now what?
Okay, let's just say that cow's in a body condition score of 3 today. I got to get her to a 5 in March. So that's 2 body condition scores. That's about 160 pounds, give or take. Now I've got to put a program. I've got to program that cow to go from a 3 to a 5. 160 pounds, I've got 100 days, 1.6 pounds a day. It's pretty simple to do that, to get that cow turned around. And I got to tell you, we need to start now before it really gets cold. Once it gets cold, a lot of that body energy is going in to stay warm. Okay?
Great point. Dr. Farmer, what would you add?
Well, I would add this. Those are great points, and I would say that, at least in my part of the world, one of the things that producers skip over when they evaluate what kind of program they're going to get on to help fix their situation is they forget that the first question shouldn't be, what am I going to feed and how much am I going to feed? They need to step back and understand what the requirements are first, like Dr. Patterson was saying, so that they don't get themselves in a bind and come up short. And the thing that's really hard to get over sometimes is the requirement of that cow doesn't change just because we're in a drought. And so many times people want to kind of sidestep that and say, well, I'm just going to kind of get her by or halfway take care of her. Well, that'll actually put you in a worse situation because you spent money to have a skinny cow at the end of the day, and you don't want to be in that spot. So if you just step back and understand, hey, here's her requirement. It's the same as it's always been. Now you can say, how much of my forage base can help me get at that? And then once you figure that out, now you can put a plan in place that gets you to where you need to be when the calves start calving in the spring. Or in my part of the world, the folks, they've calved in the fall in many places, so now they're sitting there and we have to decide what we're going to do as we go into the breeding season right about now. So either calving season, you have to make sure your program is lined out ahead of time so that you don't come up short.
Kent, what other considerations would you tell us to keep in mind as we consider how we might fulfill some of the deficiencies once we've identified them?
Well, right now, you know, we've got a lot of poor quality forages. I mean, there's a lot of CRP hay put up, a lot of corn stalks being put up now, and you know, a little bit of go. Luckily, we had a good-sized wheat crop, so a lot of guys had access to wheat straw. With all these poor forages, we can get feed into these cattle, but we got to make sure we're meeting the requirements. And those forages are really low in protein. And without the protein, and you feed the rumen bugs, they can't do their work. So we've got to get the protein into those to feed the bugs so that they can break down that forage, and then you can get the energy into the cow.
And a real basic question, I mean, what advice would you give people who are trying to figure out just how much hay or forage they're going to need to get through the winter?
It's going to depend on the body size of your cows, and of course up north we tend to have bigger cows. And in my area, we see the 1,300-pound cows. It takes almost 40 pounds of forage a day for these cows. And when they dry off, of course, it drops down. But you need to start figuring out, okay, how much forage am I going to need? Yeah, we can limit feed them to extent because they're looking for energy, but to do that, we need to make sure we're getting enough protein to get those bacteria to release that energy.
Well, gentlemen, this is a great beginning to our conversation, and I look forward to a few more questions. Ahead on this special edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman, we'll take a close look on how to use feed alternatives in your rations this winter. We'll be right back.
No storm is too powerful for new Purina Wind and Rain Storm Minerals, formulated with ultimate weather resistance. That means more minerals in the feeder and available to your cattle. Wind and Rain Storm Minerals provide more consistent intake and balanced mineral nutrition to optimize herd health and breedback rates. See the difference at your local Purina dealer or visit cattlenutrition.com. Wind and Rain Storm Minerals, another way Purina is building better cattle.
I'm an NCBA member.
I'm an NCBA member because I think as an advocacy group, NCBA has done some great things for our industry, and I kind of feel compelled to give back some of what they've done for us.
I'm an NCBA member because it's an organization that stands up for the industry that I love and will allow my family to continue to be a part of this great industry.
Because this organization is looking out for cattle producers.
I'm an NCBA member because NCBA doesn't pick and choose what issues it works on. It works on every issue, every day, on behalf of all the cattlemen across the country.
They understand what makes our cow-calf business profitable.
Join me and thousands of other cattlemen across the country.
Join me today.
Join me today.
Join NCBA today and receive a new member gift while supplies last. Head to beefusa.org and enter the promo code C2C or call 866-USA-BEEF and mention C2C.
To advance the traits that are important to your cow-calf operation, why settle for Angus bulls and females that come with less information when you can have more? Compared with genomic-enhanced EPDs powered by HD50K, no other genomic test provides you with more dependable data on calving ease, growth, and other important traits to accelerate the goals of your operation. For more informed purchase decisions and faster genetic progress, one genomic test outshines the rest.
Get your boots on the bay for the 2013 Annual Convention and NCBA Trade Show. Join me, J.D. Alexander, for Boots on the Bay as we attend important industry meetings and kick back for some fun with our fellow cattlemen and women at the Cattlemen's Beach Party featuring the Beach Boys. You won't want to miss the Hot Havana Nights after party with the Bellamy Brothers. For more information, visit beefusa.org. So pack up your boots. I'll see you in Tampa Bay.
Welcome back to this special edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. This week, we're talking about getting your cattle through the tough winter after this year's serious drought conditions. And as cattlemen know, there's really nothing more important than proper cattle nutrition. Let's return to our discussion. Dr. Patterson, you know, we've had a lot of media coverage around alternative feed sources. And of course, these range from region to region, but tell us about some of the alternative feeds you hear about people using.
Probably the biggest one is the distiller's dried grains, and maybe the distiller's wet grains as well. Corn gluten feed. You know, we've talked about potatoes, we've talked about orange peel products, things like that, soybean hulls and that. So there's a lot of products, but they're regional in nature. Beet pulp that, you know, can't go because it's wet. It would be a good example. So a lot of these byproducts are pretty regional, and you got to figure out what's available to you. One that I really like, I wish we had it on cows in the Southwest, is rice bran, because it's got so much fat in it, but it's pretty hard to transport products like that.
And you know, you talk about obviously cost being an issue and so forth, but what about safety? I've heard some safety issues. What would you tell folks relative to that with alternative feed sources?
Well, my experience has been primarily in the upper Rockies, and a lot of sulfate in the water, okay, in the drinking water. Well, some of these byproducts can also be high in sulfate. So if you mix the high sulfate that might be in, say, distiller's grains with the high sulfate in the water, you're going to end up with a problem called polio or stargazing. And so be really careful when you're feeding, you know, much more than 3 or 4 pounds of that product, because you might tip those cattle into polio or stargazing. So get not only analysis of your forage, let's get an analysis of a byproduct alternative feed that we're going to feed. Let's see what we've got in there. Are there any other benefits other than the cost that come along with feeding some of these byproducts? Oh, I think these byproducts are excellent replacement in there, but just got to be careful with them. I think my co-panelists know a lot more about mold issues, other issues on that, but where we've fed dry products, sulfate has by far been the biggest issue that we've had to deal with. And you mentioned the word mold. Dr. Tejardis, I was going to ask you that question. What are some of the issues you see relative to mold and aflatoxins? Yeah, one of the biggest problems this year with going through the drought, and then we had some late rains, is that a lot of aflatoxins ended up on the corn. And some plants, you know, the mills have rejected it. Some of the ethanol, a lot of the ethanol plants will use some of that's got the aflatoxin on there. The challenge is that gets concentrated about 3-fold. And so the distiller's grains can carry some aflatoxin. So not only do you have to worry about your corn, but worry about your distiller's grains, because, you know, to a pregnant cow, over 20 part per billion aflatoxin, you can abort that calf. When she's lactating, of course, she's excreting aflatoxin in her milk, and that can be a real serious challenge to those young calves. And Carrie, you'd mentioned a little earlier that you do feed quite a few alternative feed products. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about the products that you feed and why you feed them? What are some of the benefits that you see to the various feed ingredients? Well, we're always trying to satisfy our protein and energy needs as cheap as we can, whether we're growing these cattle or whether we're finishing them. And we fed soy hulls and hominy, and we feed wet distillers, and we feed whatever forage we can get our hands on that's cheapest to work around that. Beet pulp goes in our grower rations. We're feeding some beet tailings. We've been experimenting, and I don't know enough about this yet to see how it's going to go, but we're mixing hydrated lime with corn stalks to try to break the lignin down to increase the value of these corn stalks. We've fed potatoes and onions in the past, although we're not able to do that right now. But that's our strategy, and I try to look with the end in mind so we can price some of these ingredients ahead of time or get our hands on them, because that's kind of the ball game today, is get your feed lined up at the same time you do the cattle. And what would you tell people, I mean, are you working with your nutritionist? What would you tell people relative to how they sit down and pencil through these options? Well, we've got a good nutritionist we work with, and depending on how the products are moving in price-wise in the market, we just try to put in the rations whatever we think's cheapest. Sure. So, yeah, you've got to have a good nutritionist who's creative, which we've got. So. And one of those feedstuffs, of course, Kent, is corn stalks. Now, what guidance would you give us as we think about how best to use corn stalks and actually make the most out of the corn stalks? Well, like we talked about earlier, corn stalks are, you know, a good fiber source. You can get some feed into the cattle, but they're really poor protein level. And then if you don't add the protein to it, you can't get the fiber to break down. And like Carrie said, that, you know, they are looking at different alternatives to try to break the lignin down and make it more digestible. Hydrated lime or calcium oxide is one product one reaction that we're looking at. You know, in the past, people have ammoniated
wheat straw, corn stalks, that's another option. That actually adds protein as well as breaking down the lignin and makes it more digestible. But the main thing is just trying to get a protein supplement too with it, so that the bacteria is what we're actually feeding is bacteria and the microbes in the rumen, and let them do a lot of their work to help break down that forage.
Now, Kent, we don't have many soybeans around here, but I do hear people even baling up soybean stalks this fall and trying to feed them. Is there a limit to what you can do from a soybean stalk standpoint?
Yeah, the soybean stubble, I mean, that is really poor quality. I mean, that's just a filler. Cattle are only going to eat a certain amount. There's not a lot of energy to it, so you need to add some more energy feeds with that. There was some soybean hay put up. Now that's going to be real dusty, but of course when they baled it up it had leaves, so of course that's a lot higher in protein and more digestible. So make sure you test what you've got and try to design your nutrition program around it, so we're not basically causing a deficiency in the cows or not getting enough protein into them.
Well, so talk to us more about that, specifically for, let's say, cow-calf operations that have located some feedstuffs like corn stalks or soybean stalks or what have you. What else should they be feeding to make sure that they keep these cows on a good nutritional plane and don't get into some of the fetal programming issues that both of you have mentioned?
Well, Dr. Patterson had talked about sulfur, but one of the big things with these poor quality forages also, we can get some mineral imbalances, but phosphorus is a big thing that we talked about earlier. Typically, we've got better quality forages. They have more phosphorus in them, and it's not that critical to supplement a lot of phosphorus. Well, with these poor quality forages that didn't grow very well, they're really low in phosphorus, and that's the last thing we want to do is get deficiencies. It's important for reproduction, for milk production. I mean, if we don't get enough phosphorus, we're going to have more open cows, and if they don't lactate very well, then we're going to hurt our weaning weights in the end game. So that's important, and then a good trace mineral program to go along with it, because we're going to have a lot of imbalances in minerals depending on what kind of forages we're going to use and where they're coming from.
Depending on where our viewers live, Chance, some of them just gotten through weaning, others in a fall calving program are looking on to weaning. What would you tell us relative to the economics of feeding that pair versus weaning early? And talk to us a little bit about how those comparisons work, about the nutritional requirements of that dry cow versus the lactating cow.
Right. That's a great question, and actually really good management tool that producers can use to manage through a drought is the early weaning process. And here's the primary reason why. In a drought, what are you short of? You're short of forage. Well, if you actually calculate what a cow that's lactating consumes and what her calf consumes, a 1,200-pound cow, at least in my part of the world, we're talking about 40 pounds of dry matter per day out of your pasture with that pair. Versus if you wean the calf off, obviously his 10 pounds of contribution to the forage intake's gone, plus the cow requirement now is lower, so she eats less forage. Now we're talking about 24 pounds a day forage dry matter versus the 40 with the pair. So 16 pound a day forage dry matter difference times however many cows you have, times however many days this drought lasts, you can see pretty quick how you can reduce your forage use quite a bit by just early weaning those calves. And a lot of people say, well, am I going to take a hit by selling those early weaned calves? Well, really today, with the market we have, you can strip and ship those calves and still make a good bit of money on an early weaned calf. But by the same token, if you have the resources, you don't want to pull any resources away from your cows, but if you have resources, you can wean those calves, and there's a really attractive feed cost to gain today relative to what that value of that gain is too. So you can make it work by backgrounding those calves too. But the key is getting them off your pasture or off of your hay, your stored forage, so that you have enough to get through the entirety of the drought. So that's why early weaning makes a lot of sense.
We've done programs before with folks that have implemented early weaning. How early would you say in a lot of these early weaning programs, what works?
Right. Most of the time we try to like to keep them on for at least a couple months. But we've seen situations where we had to take them off in a month just because that's what we had to do. I will tell you that that's a very interesting calf to have to wean, and you need to contact somebody that's had experience with that to make sure that you don't get in a wreck there if you choose to keep and background those calves. But really 2 to 3 months old is kind of where you really can make a huge difference, because when they get 2 to 3 months old, that's when they're starting to contribute to the forage use more so than a really light calf. So,
Dr. Patterson, for folks who decide to kind of skinny up on some of the supplement to those cows, what impact does that have on a newborn calf, in your opinion?
Well, I think we could impact the immune function. Some of the really great old work showed that when you cut protein down on these cows, I'm going to cheapen this thing up, that our death rate on those calves, they may be born alive, but we get into an immune breakdown, and I'm thinking of some of the work out of Wyoming, lost 19% of the calves because the cows were deficient in protein during gestation. So weak calf syndrome is what we're talking about.
Gentlemen, these are some really important considerations and really helpful information. We'll continue the discussion right after this. Stay with us.
You're not responsible for the weather, just the cattle. And Rangeland works as hard as you do to deliver performance, production, and profitability. Cattle need consistent nutrition. They'll get it year-round with Rangeland products from Land O'Lakes. Deliver what they need free choice in weather-resistant loose minerals and mineral and protein tubs. Get the most out of your forage. See your Land O'Lakes Co-op for products that will stand up to whatever Mother Nature throws at us. Weather's coming in. Rangeland. Consider it done.
I'm looking forward to having Vista Once back. We weren't able to find an equivalent product.
I think our practice will be very quick to adopt Vista when it comes back.
All of my veterinary colleagues have all talked about the product coming back.
We're glad to have Vista back in the product line.
Cattlemen that we work with will be glad to have the product.
We have a lot of producers that are excited about it coming back.
Yeah, can I recommend Vista Once? Yeah, that's going to go right back in the cooler, and it goes right back in the calves.
Hello, I'm David.
I'm Howard.
We're the Bellamy Brothers. Join us for Boots on the Bay in the Sunshine State of Florida. The 2013 Cattle Industry Annual Convention and NCBA Trade Show is set to be the largest convention and trade show in the business.
It's happening in Tampa, Florida from February the 6th through the 9th. It's a chance to network with ranchers from every corner of the cattle community and to learn more about the industry trends and techniques.
We're excited to bring some great country music to the Bay. The Cowboys Beach Bash will feature bands like the Beach Boys.
And the Hot Havana Nights event on the Riverwalk will feature yours truly. There's also a chance you'll run into a band of pirates at the Gasparilla Pirate Fest.
To learn more about these events and more, head to beefusa.org or log on to Facebook. I'm a grandson of the Southland and heir to the Confederacy. You ain't just a whistling Dixie.
Welcome back to this special edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. This week, we're talking to the experts about proper animal nutrition during the tough winter months ahead after this year's historic drought. Let's get back to our discussion. Kent, I was going to ask you a question. What happens if your pasture resources are totally exhausted and you're considering dry lotting cows? What is your experience there?
Yeah, dry lotting is an option. The first thing you need to definitely look at is you can put a cow-calf pair in the dry lot, but you're better off splitting the pairs and then just feeding them separate, especially in the dry lot situation. It's going to be easier. You know, back in the 90s in Illinois and Ohio, actually I did some work, and Dr. Lurch at Ohio State had done work on limit feeding cows where you feed only about 0.5% of body weight hay, and then depending on the size of the cow, it could be somewhere with 10 to 12 pounds of corn. Well, that's back when corn was $2 a bushel. Now we're talking $7.50 a bushel, and it's really hard to make that work in the limit feeding side. You can run the pencil and try to see if that'll work in your situation, but most of the time we're talking about using stuff like corn stalks and wheat straw and soybean stubble. You know, fill those cows up, get some energy into them with byproducts, distillers grains, gluten feed, you know, anything that we can get, maybe a little bit of corn, and basically feeding those cows with the poor quality forage, some protein supplement, and getting by. But it will cost, you know, we're looking at about $3 a day. So you need to decide, are we going to be in the cattle business or do we need to move those cows on?
And Dr. Farmer, I was going to ask you, you know, fiber and roughage are not the same thing, and sometimes we can get in as much trouble feeding some of these high fiber products as we can high starch products. Fair enough?
That's exactly right. If you think about what your forage base does for you, your pasture, your hay, it provides a fiber-based energy source, plus it provides that all-important roughage. You say, well, why is roughage important? Roughage provides that scratch factor in the rumen, gives you more rumen motility, causes the cows to salivate more, which helps buffer the rumen. What you're really doing is you're just promoting a healthier rumen environment. If you have a healthy rumen, you're going to have a healthy cow that's going to perform. Some of these higher fiber byproducts like soy hulls, corn gluten feed, and some of these things, they're excellent energy sources and should be used in these situations. But if you don't put some roughage with it, you could really wind up with some acidosis, bloat, scours. And even in a couple of droughts that we've seen in Texas where folks only use these high fiber byproducts and not a roughage source, we actually had some cows that were foundered. So they put all that money into them to get them through the drought, and then they wind up with a cow that they actually have to get rid of at the end. So you got to make sure that just because it's a high fiber feed doesn't mean necessarily it's a really safe feed. You need to make sure you have roughage in that diet as well. So.
Dr. Tijardis, you were talking about corn before. I've heard about rejected grains. I mean, what are some of the cautions you would offer if we're going to try to feed cattle some grains that have been rejected, and how much of that can we get away with?
Yeah, like we talked earlier, this year aflatoxin is usually the biggest concern because of the drought where the ear was opened up. We got the moisture and the molds grew that produced the aflatoxin. So like we said earlier, with cows, about 20 parts per billion of aflatoxin, and that's the threshold that most of the feed mills, the grain handling facilities do reject the corn. Now, so we need to be cautious with the cows. Now on the feedlot side, we're more fortunate. We can go up to 300 part per billion. So, a lot higher. We can take those grains in, cheapen up some of our rations, and still have a safe feed to feed them. In other cases, you just need to see what you got and try to blend it down.
Very good. And Dr. Farmer, another question to you. What was your advice relative to feeding like baled corn or baled milo stalks rather than hay?
Right. In our part of the world anyway, hay is fed free choice, and typically you put it out and you put a round bale feeder around it. And the way that that's managed is when the hay is just about gone, then you go out and you put more grass hay. Well, if you're having to switch over because you can't get grass hay to corn stalks or milo stubble, you have to realize that if you're sitting there with 2 foot of these stalks that are this long and this big around in the bottom of your hay feeder, that it's probably time to go ahead and put some more forage out because they're not going to eat that forage. If you decide that you're going to, quote, make them clean it up, then what you wind up with is cows that are hungry for 2 or 3 days, and what that means is less body condition, and then you get into some performance problems. So you have to manage it differently than what you do grass hay. You have to be ready to pull the trigger to put out more forage when they really need it.
And I know we don't have much up in this country, but what about some of our viewers who feed gin trash? What guidance would you give there?
Right. Gin trash is something that we have some of in the South where we have cotton gins and so forth. And what I would tell you on that is you can use that, but you need to proceed with caution. What I would tell you is to not expect that to be your sole source of nutrition and expect a great outcome. And here's 3 reasons for that. Most of the time that is bought because it's a roughage replacement for your hay or silage or whatever you have, because of the cotton burrs that are left in the gin trash. But there's 3 things nutritionally you got to remember about gin trash that make it less desirable maybe than what it seems up front. The first thing is when you buy gin trash, 15 to 20% of it's dirt. And so you're right off the bat, it may seem like a good deal, but a lot of it is something you already have plenty of. The second part of that is you're buying it for roughage, but there's a lot of cotton fiber left in gin trash. And because of that, if you just go dump a load out on pasture and that's going to be their sole source of nutrition, for 3 or 4 days you may have cows that are actually pretty loose because they're sorting through that really highly digestible fiber that's coming from that cotton. And then what you're left with is the cotton burr, and the only way they'll eat that is if it's kind of mixed with something else or if it's small enough that they can eat it. And so what you were trying to provide is roughage, and at the end of the day, that's the last thing they got out of it. If you're going to use it, it's a lot better to put it in a TMR or total mix ration with other ingredients to provide some energy because it's low in energy, and then also provide some true roughage that helps continue to make rumen health as optimal as we can get it. So you can use it, but don't expect it to be the be-all end-all for your nutrition program.
Very good. And Dr. Tijardis, a question back to you. As you think about some of the complete feeds and the hay in our country costing $200+ a ton, what are the complete feed options that would rival that $200 a ton target?
The challenge is anytime hay gets driven up, a lot of, like the summer when we saw the severe drought, a lot of these byproducts that are fiber-based byproducts also go up, we saw soy hulls and wheat mids, they were up over 300 because they're primarily used for cake and creep feeds. Distillers went up over 300 for the energy in that. So it gets challenging for us to make a complete feed that's going to rival that. Most of the time we're looking at trying to improve the efficiency of using the other feeds on that situation. But the biggest thing I always tell people is also look at the forages. When we're going to spend $200 on hay, let's make sure we're not wasting it. That's the biggest concern I have with producers is they'll just throw unroll the bale, or they'll use those old hay wagons. That could lose 50%. So now we talk, you got $200 hay that became $300 hay. So look into using hay busters or TMR mixes, or even going and buying those newer hay feeders that have the, they hold the hay up and it's got a hay saver around the outside. So we only get about 20% waste instead of 50% waste, and maybe we can get down even further than that and save some cost.
I'd like to follow up on that with you, Dr. Farmer. What other suggestions would you give us relative to stretching some of our roughage?
Right. It's important to make sure that you understand how much you need to get through this drought spell from point A to point B. And once you figure that out, if you say, wow, I don't have but about half the hay I need, it's really imperative that you switch to a program that allows you to use half as much of that hay and still get your nutrient requirements met. A way to safely and economically do that is to use something that helps limit the intake of a TMR or something like that. Our AccuRation program helps to limit the intake of a higher concentrate feed that would normally be very dangerous to feed by itself, but we're able to get away with more grain in the cattle, and we can cut back on the amount of energy they have to get from your roughage sources, which is in short supply. So it's important to make sure that you know how much you have, how much you need, and then you can find some of these programs like the AccuRation program to help extend what you have. Our AccuRation Forage Extender program has helped us a lot in Texas get at that. So,
Dr. Patterson, we've talked a lot about the importance of supplements, but what happens when we find that our cows are eating too much supplement?
Well, I've run into this often, and what I suspect is going on, they've run out of forage out there. They're out of groceries, and so the only thing that's available to them is a supplement, and they're going to overconsume on that. So it looks to me, Kevin, you've only got two choices. Either you got to get them out of that pasture and get them onto a pasture that's got more forage, or you got to take them to dry lot, or you got to get rid of some cows, because you're out of balance on that. I think a lot of that overconsumption is due that they've just run out of an energy feed stuff out there.
Yeah. Dr. Farmer, I want to come back to you. I say this with hesitation. I'm hopeful that you're a year out of the worst part of your drought. Let's us make that assumption. So I'm interested in what we can learn. What are some of the implications? What are some of the key learnings as you reflect back now a year later on what some of us have just gone through this last summer?
Right. Well, I would like to kind of just reiterate the point that Dr. Patterson just made. You know pretty quick on particularly a self-fed supplement, you've got a forage quantity issue when their intake really goes up on that supplement. And so the way that we've gotten at that on some of these ranches that have, unfortunately in South Texas, for instance, we've had a drought every other year for the last 10 years. And so the way they've gotten at that is a lot of those folks have half as many cows as they had a decade ago. But a lot of those places are also weaning about the same number of pounds off that place as they did before. They're just taking the good years and stockpiling some of that grass, and they're able to maintain their supplementation program, which is a lower cost program than putting them in a dry lot and feeding them everything they get, or taking them to town and selling them because we can't afford that. So really the best long-term plan is to really watch that stocking rate and pull it back to where it really needs to be, to where you have stockpiled forage in your pasture that you can utilize in those years that are really tough from a precipitation standpoint.
Yeah, that's good advice. Kerry, I'd be interested in your perspective. What do you see as some of the longer-term implications of this drought that we're experiencing?
I think the big thing for the stocker and feed yard is we probably prolong the cattle expansion for another year, I suppose. And I'd like to think when we get done killing these cows, all these cows, both in the dairy industry and the beef industry, that the calf market's going to get really good and the beef prices are going to get really good at some point. So, I mean, I'm concerned about keeping the feed yard, all the feed yards, and we've got overcapacity in the cattle feeding side of it as well as the packing side. So I hope that they survive and get through till we get the cow numbers back up. So
I also want to follow up. You'd mentioned something during break that it's fundamentally changing what kind of cattle you're buying, the weights of those cattle, and even when you're buying it. Tell us a little bit about those impacts.
Well, we started procuring calves probably a month or two early just because they were there, which they typically didn't happen until the usual fall runs, at least for us. We're buying lighter calves probably because there's not as much competition for those cattle going to wheat pasture because it isn't there. We're trying to buy lighter calves to get as far away from these high cost of gains as we can and get some of those into 2013 corn. So those are some changes that we've made, I guess, on our operation.
And John, you know, there's been a lot of good information shared already here today, but what do you say to viewers who say, hey, you've answered some of my questions, I still have a lot of other questions I want to ask. What other resources would you point them towards?
If there's ever a time to not be shy, it's right now. You got to reach out and get a hold of some guys. Like these three right here are excellent resources for you. State beef cattle extension specialists, the local county agent, the local veterinarian. And listen to these guys have just a light went on. Man, I got to go talk to an equipment guy. If I'm going to have to use wheat straw, they're not going to eat it in a big bale. Maybe I need to invest in a forage chopper or something to chop it, and I might have to invest in some bunks where I can put a chopped forage, because we know if we chop it, increase intake 20%. That's the energy going into that cow. So yeah, lots of resources out there. Don't be shy. Call them up and ask their help.
Well, gentlemen, I'd like to have a couple of you weigh in on this next question about the economics. I mean, as people begin pushing their pencils and saying, how do I get from now to that time that Kerry was talking about, maybe 6, 8, 9 months from now that we anticipate some great cattle prices, what guidance chance would you give people as they start crunching those numbers?
Yeah, it really is a situation where you have to decide up front, am I in or am I out? And what I mean by that is it may cost you $3 per cow per day to get that dry cow from point A to point B. And so what you have to do is be very real with yourself and say, hey, can I afford to do that on all my cows for this extended period of time? If you can't, then you need to sell the cows that you can't afford to feed. Because the last thing you want to do is decide, okay, I can't afford to spend $3 a day on my cows, so I'm only going to spend $2 or maybe $1.50. And then all your cows get skinny, and you have that 50% breed up. Now you just paid for that 50% breed up over that time frame. That's the last place you want to be. You want to make sure up front you can afford to do it. If you can't, go ahead and sell the cows. It's not a bad thing to do that. It's better to have that money in the bank than to spend all that money to get a skinny cow at the end of the day.
That's good advice. Kent, what would you add?
Well, this year was one of the years where, you know, we had a lot of calves that were weaned earlier, and most people are used to those, you know, 500, maybe even 600-pound weaning weights.
Sure.
A lot of guys, they decided to try to background. They looked at it, put a pencil to it, you know, looked at some of our complete programs like Impact Background or Impact Grower, where you didn't have to have any roughage, but you could just self-feed. Now, of course, dollars per ton, it looks expensive, but when you're putting four pounds of gain and being really efficient with these young lightweight calves and taking these 3 weights up to 5, they found, you know, real economic to that, because you're, you know, doing it for maybe $1 or less per pound of gain, and you're selling it for $1.40 or more. So that's another area that guys are looking at, is they've never background before, and they're looking at other opportunities.
So considering new ways and new management practices, really thinking differently about your operation. Kerry, you get to do this every day. What guidance would you give us from an economic standpoint?
An old rancher told me one time, you better run out of cattle before you run out of feed. So I tried to look at that now from the feedlot and stocker operation, that we got to plan a lot further ahead than we had to in the past as far as all our protein and energy sources.
That's great. Guys, this is great advice, and I really appreciate your willingness to share it. We'll have final thoughts from our panelists right after this. Stay with us.
Well, I think a rancher has to be a steward of the land. There's nobody else that can take care of land better than a rancher. When we switched over to the Purina products, it was a step in the right direction.
The difference we see in the cattle is the consistency of their nutrition.
The cattle hold their condition a lot better throughout the whole year.
It does make a difference that we can see, day in and day out.
When it comes to versatility on your operation, nothing beats a John Deere D-Series skid steer. They're not only great for cleaning and feed chores, but with John Deere Worksite Pro attachments, you can tackle just about any job thrown your way. You asked for versatility. and John Deere delivered. These rock-solid machines are built to last. See your dealer today.
There's something wrong. His head is down. He's clearly stressed. He's worried sick about BRD. That's why there's prescription Zactran for BRD treatment and control in high-risk cattle. Get a rapid response plus 10-day treatment and control in a single dose, so you can stop worrying and get back to business. For use in cattle only, do not treat cattle within 35 days of slaughter. Because a discard time in milk has not been established, do not use in female dairy cattle 20 months of age or older, or in calves to be processed for veal. The effects of Zactran on bovine reproductive performance, pregnancy, and lactation have not been determined. Don't worry yourself sick. Talk to your veterinarian about a real alternative for BRD treatment and control. Because it's critical, it's Zactran from Mariel, a leading animal health company.
Let's face it, you don't think a lot about your trailer hitch. You use it and forget it. We understand. But at B&W, we think about it. Short nights, the long hauls, never-ending chores. The unthinkable. We think about it all, so you don't have to. B&W. Trusted.
70% of consumers want to know where their food comes from, and how can we ignore them? IMI Global offers third-party audited source and age verification essential for export markets and specialty markets like natural, organic, omnivoric, Eskimo, or possibly recovering vegan certified. For quality and age producers to the big boys, any cattleman who wants to expand his market, you're not just buying this green ear tag, you're buying peace of mind. IMIglobal.com. The week before Christmas, the farmer announced to the animals that he would not be giving them the traditional cheese and sausage box. The pig was very relieved. We'll draw names, he said. On Christmas morning, the gifts were exchanged. The buzzard had drawn the possum, and he gave him a can of fluorescent paint and a backpack with reflector tape. That way, the buzzard explained, the cars will see you crossing in time to swerve, and if they don't, it'll be easier for me to spot you when you're flat out on the highway. The dog presented the cat with a gift certificate to be spayed. She reciprocated by giving the dog a toy flea circus. Well, by some coincidence, the sheep had all drawn each other, and each gave the other a picture of a sheep. Some thought it was a mirror. Well, the rooster thought it would be a great joke to give the mouse a piece of cheese in a trap. But the mouse had already arranged for the rooster to visit the famous poultry bed and breakfast at the Campbell Chicken Noodle Soup Museum. It included a room with a stew. Sorry. There was great excitement between the goat and the mare. The goat had always envied the mare's magnificent tail, so she had the farmer clip it, and the birds wove it into a beautiful hairpiece. And the goat put it high up on his pole between his horns. It made him look like a debutante at her cotillion party in Lubbock, Texas when I was a kid. The cow offered to rub the coyote's back, and it went okay until he said, "A little more to the right." She broke his tail. It healed crooked, and now when he wags it, he looks like a flagman on an aircraft carrier. At the end of the evening, the farmer and his wife were given a rousing Christmas toast by their barnyard employees. They'd all chipped in, pardon the pun, and bought him a book autographed by all their cloven-hoofed and feathered edible animal friends entitled The Vegetarian Cookbook, or How to Get the Most Out of a Tuber During the Holidays. The sweet potato was so pleased. This is Baxter Black. Merry Christmas from all of us out there.
Welcome back to this special live edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. We're wrapping up our discussion about alternative feeds and surviving the impacts of this year's drought. Let's get our final thoughts, and Carrie, I'd like to begin with you.
I guess the big thing is just got to stay flexible on what your protein and energy needs are going to be. And we try to begin with the end in mind and plan ahead the best we can. And also be flexible on the types of cattle we're buying and weights. The other thing I think is you just got to try to keep your chin up. When our crops were burning up this summer, a friend of mine, a ski buddy of mine, used to call me and say, just think about it, we're sitting in the hot tub with the snow piled up on our head this winter up in the mountains. So I think that's part of it, so you stay focused.
Yeah, stay focused and stay optimistic. That's helpful. Chance?
My final thoughts would be these, and this is kind of the general plan that's come about. Unfortunately, in Texas, every other year we have a drought, it seems like, and this is kind of what I've learned. Number one, cull the cows that need to be culled anyway, all those slackers. Second thing is early wean your calves. And third thing, decide whether you're in or you're out. And if you're in, prepare appropriately from a budget standpoint. Decide if you can actually appropriately feed those cows. If you can't, sell them, or at least sell off to what you can afford. Otherwise, you're sitting out there halfway taking care of your cows and you spend a lot of money for nothing.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Kent, what would you add?
I think the big thing is to watch your body condition, make sure we're in ideal condition, because when you let it drop, it actually costs you more to get back in that condition to where you're going to have the most reproduction, the best weaning weights. So let's not let it drop. We can use those poor quality forages, but let's analyze it, see what we need as far as protein and maybe some energy supplementation, and get our mineral program lined up right.
And Dr. Patterson, what guidance would you give us?
Well, if you want to learn about this and other issues, credit issues, water issues, family issues, taking care of that cow, this Idea Field program, come to Cattlemen's College, February 6th in Tampa Bay. You'll not be disappointed. This may be one of the best cattle programs you'll see in the next year.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Thank you guys for your time. And don't forget to join us, just as Dr. Patterson said, February 6th through the 9th for Boots on the Bay. It's the 2013 Cattle Industry Annual Convention and NCBA Trade Show. Now you can get details at beefusa.org. And thank you for joining us for this week's edition of NCBA's Cattleman to Cattleman. I hope we'll see you right back here next week on RFD TV.